BootHole could let attackers get a toehold on your organization.
So Mike, this is an interesting story you have for us today relating to Grub 2, the bootloader that I think most versions of Linux use. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, this was a really interesting vulnerability that's been identified for a few different reasons. It's one that isn't rated necessarily as critical, but it's one that we're going to need to be aware of. The boot process just off the start really is the foundational security aspect for any device, right? The boot process is what loads up drivers, low-level firmware code, and ultimately gives rise to your operating system and other value-added applications. So in general, the earlier that code is loaded on the machine, the more privilege and control it's going to have of anything that comes after that. And recognizing this, there are controls in place to provide some security around the bootload process. And the secure bootloader. Secure boot is really, kind of the standard through the UEFI model for PCs and servers. And to prevent malicious code from being introduced into that boot process, the code that's being executed at that point is cryptographically checked, and anything that doesn't meet that cryptographic check gets discarded in an ideal world. So some researchers identified a vulnerability in the Grub 2 bootloader that they're calling BootHole, and this is CVE 2020-10713. And ultimately, this is a heap overflow vulnerability which impacts Grub 2 versions prior to 2.06. And so what happens, without getting into like the low-level architectural details of the bootloader process and the signature validations and what have you, is that ultimately the Grub 2 shim and bootloader there reads from an unencrypted, cryptographically checked, so it doesn't have any certificate authority check associated with it, a configuration file called grub.cfg. So it's not signed, it's not encrypted. And the boot process, which is signed and encrypted, reads data and processes data from that configuration file. So an attacker that has access to that is going to be able to submit values that are too large for the fixed buffer sizes in the subsequent bootloader code. And because the boot process lacks advanced memory protection mechanisms like ASLR or DEP, that getting arbitrary code execution to occur through this process is comparatively quite easy. And so this is really something that, while it's not going to be an initial compromise vector because an attacker would have to have access to the device, they would have to be in a position to be able to make edits to this file, it is a really, really cool way for an attacker to gain persistence and load up malware at an incredibly low level on a machine that's going to then have the ability to really undermine other elements in your security and OS stack that come loaded later on. And it would potentially give attackers a great place to hide and, maintain their, presence into an enterprise for quite some time. And while this definitely is going to be impacting, Linux distributions, the problem is actually going to be really widespread, and it's going to be very, very hard to remediate. Grub 2 supports other operating systems and kernels, hypervisors such as Zen. Any system using secure boot, even if they're not using Grub 2, has this heap vulnerability in it, apparently. Grub 2 simply seems to be the execution mechanism. And that, as you said, Linux distributions are going to be widely affected, but not just those distributions, but also appliances and other purpose-built devices that might be in IT environments or OT environments or medical environments that are built on a Linux kernel which leverage this. kind of a process. So this is going to be one that is going to rear its ugly head in some very unique ways and be very widespread. And because of the fact that changing bootloader code does run a lot of risks of bricking machines, patching is going to take quite some time. You've seen evidence already of some of the initial patches released for, I think, Red Hat, causing machines not to boot up any longer and having to be recovered. So that's going to be, a cautionary sign where administrators are going to have to move forward very, very slowly with testing of any kind of patches that come out for remediation. But you're also going to need to watch out for backups. You're going to need to watch out for legacy installation media that you've, got that doesn't include subsequent patches. So this is one that is going to be around for a while, and that's one of the most interesting things about it for me.
Yeah, another one of those low-level ones that, like you said, it's probably going to last for quite a long time because there's so many things that rely on it that just aren't going to get patched. So many, I don't know, it feels like a couple of years back we had just a whole bunch of processor level bugs and then a bunch of like C library bugs all kind of coming in the same span of a couple months. Deep stuff.
Yeah, I think, these are the worst types of bugs, right? The ones that aren't easily patched, the ones that do run the risk of bricking systems or potentially taking down things that, make money or hold important data. So, Mike, you're absolutely right. We're going to see this for a while. It's probably going to rear its ugly head a number of times in the future. I guess the only advice to give administrators and the like is find those systems and patch them, right, and update them. Just be diligent. That's really what it comes down to. Any other suggestions? Any other advice that we could give other than update and patch now?
I think that really, patching is a great guidance, but ultimately there are going to be challenges with that. And even once you patch, again, that reoccurrence factor with this is probably going to be pretty high. So really making sure that you've got a strong detective control framework in your organization that is going to be able to identify malicious activity or suspicious activity occurring on your network, engaging in proactive threat hunting, and the like are going to be key as part of a layered defense model to be able to keep issues like this in check. Because again, this is going to require somebody to have that initial foothold in your organization to really be able to exploit.